So next, we're going to turn to our research roundtable. We've got 3 30-minute research papers to present to you, all very new research. One paper that was published a few weeks ago, one that was published yesterday, and one that has not been published yet. You're going to get a sneak peek at. So first, I'd like to welcome my colleague, Sarah Stonbely, to the stage, and she is going to present about cross-field collaboration, a research paper that we recently finished. So Sarah, floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Stefanie. I am thrilled to be here at our 6th annual Collaborative Journalism Summit. I'm very excited to be able to speak about our latest research on collaboration, which is on cross-field collaboration. And I was so glad to see everyone in person here in Chicago yesterday. Thanks to all who are joining online. It's really nice to be able to be in this space again. So the research that I'm going to talk about today is, like I said, on cross-field collaboration. I want to acknowledge a couple people. One is my co-author, Hannah Shimashko. Another is Heather Bryant, who was very involved with the research as well. And I would also like to acknowledge the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who brought this project to us and funded the research and really sort of were the foundation for the research itself. So we're really excited to be able to be here and speak about it with all of you. I would also like to note that I'm going to go through a bunch of slides today. I have all of the slides that I'm going to be able to give to everyone. And I'm not going to speak to each one of them. So I encourage you, if you are interested, to check out the slides that I will be sharing later. There's an entire website devoted to, our sub-website devoted to the project, which is collaborativejournalism.org/cross-field. And you can see everything about it there. And we also have, for those of you who are with us in person today in Chicago, a few hard copies at the registration desk. So you can grab a hard copy there if you would like. Let me start by defining cross-field collaboration. That is the cover of the hard copy, if you happen to grab one. A cross-field collaboration, as we're calling them, is a partnership involving one journalism organization, at least one journalism organization, and at least one civil society organization. The civil society organization can be an advocacy organization, but not always, in which they work together to produce content in the service of an explicit ideal or outcome. Similar in many ways to collaborative journalism, collaboration between two journalism organizations, as we defined it in our 2017 paper comparing models of collaborative journalism, but different in the sense that obviously it involves the civil society element. So this can be NGO, university, civic tech orgs, any sort of nonprofit type of organization who partners up with a journalism organization. These are usually cross-border in scope. They're usually investigative. And we have seen some of the most impactful investigative journalism and advocacy come out of cross-field collaborations in recent years. Next slide, please. So in the research that we did, we looked at 155 cross-field collaborations, so 155 specific projects. Those 155 projects spanned 125 countries around the world. And the tally of entities involved was 1,010. So it was a pretty sizable sample. So we were really happy with that. But I should say that as we continued to research, I mean, we were adding in projects up until the very last minute, and we really feel like we sort of just scratched the surface. So I think that there's a lot more to do in this space. Our method was snowball sampling. We did 52 interviews, and usually the interviews resulted in referrals to other people. Oh, let me introduce you to this person. You have to speak to this person, who I worked with on this project, et cetera. So that was great. But I should mention, some sort of methodological caveats, which is that meant that we probably didn't, snowball sampling means you're sort of like the projects that you're looking at are sort of self-referred. So as I said, there are a lot of projects that we didn't look at specifically in, I would say, Asia and the Middle East, primarily because of sort of language barriers on a part of the research team, but also because, it's just that I really think it's just there's a massive universe of projects to look at. So further research is always welcomed. We used Airtable as our primary sort of place to store all the information. And you're welcome to dig into the paper and look at that if you'd like. Next slide, please. So I'd like to give you some examples of the types of Crossfield collaborations that we looked at. Where I'm going to talk about 3 different projects, but as I said, we looked at 155 different projects. So there were a lot more as well. The first was, next slide, please, a project called Plumaje from an investigative journalism organization in Mexico called Animal Politico. Plumaje is what Animal Politico has done is basically opened up an entire subsite on their webpage to highlight and to give space to civil society organizations in Mexico. So this is something it's more than they're acting more as just a source, because these are deep relationships that they've forged over the years. I believe Animal Politico started in 2010. And they've forged deep relationships with civil society organizations. So they are, just basically giving space to them in a way that, lets the CSO, speak for themselves and really like dive into the issues in a way that they wouldn't be able to do otherwise if they were just quoted as sources or, putting out a press release or something like that. The next project that I wanted to highlight is one of these, it's from ICIJ. It's called the Fincen Files. You may be familiar with it. It's kind of like a Panama Papers style. I hope they don't mind me saying that project, which is, sort of just to say one of these very large sort of cross-border investigative projects, very sort of typical of the type of investigation into corruption and, sort of democracy and that sort of thing that we saw, involving, like I said, dozens of news organizations and then also CSOs as well. And then finally, Censors Africa is a very cool project out of Africa, which involves several news organizations and then a bunch of civic tech orgs. And what this project did was, and also involving the community as well, there's a big engagement element. They put sensors for the air quality, for water quality. And this is not only water quality, but like to monitor the weather. So like when fisher people would go out onto the water, a lot of times there's not good information about what the weather is, and they could, they get caught up in a storm or something like that. So next slide, please. I just wanted to show, this is also very typical of a lot of the projects that we looked at, where they have a dedicated webpage for the project and they'll highlight very transparently and like sort of proudly all of the different partners involved. So you'll see there's like a bunch of news organizations that are based in Africa, and then in partnership with like Code for Africa and other civic tech orgs and stuff like that. So these are just some of the projects that we looked at. I'm gonna skip this slide. So as I've sort of alluded to, there were 3 topics that really rose to the top in terms of how common they were, like what most of these projects that we looked at were about. The most common was governance and corruption. So 25% of the 155 projects in our sample were about some element of like governance, corruption, like that sort of thing. 16% were about climate or the environment, and 15% were about human rights issues, including women's rights, LGBTQ plus, and other stuff like that. So these were these are the most common topics, and you could sort of begin to see, it's not like most of these projects are not trying to highlight like good things that are happening, although I'm sure they would love to, right? It's usually like wrongdoing, malfeasance, other sketchy things happening under these umbrellas. I talked a little bit about the caveats. I can go to the next slide, please. So really, like, why has Crossfield collaboration become more prominent? What has driven, journalist organizations and civil society organizations to partner more commonly, more explicitly, with more intention? And as we began to, as we spoke to people, we spoke to 52 people in lengthy interviews, and we gathered a bunch of data through surveys that we sent out, and then obviously a lot of desk work and stuff like that, sort of research and stuff like that. We identified 3 different reasons that we think Crossfield collaboration is becoming more common. Number one, and these are not wholly different from the reason why collaborative journalism in general is becoming more common. Number one, information producers can no longer rely on the common channels for their work to be seen, right? So it's not like you don't have like a big mainstream media or like, a couple very well-read, industry outlets. Really, it's so fragmented now, the media sphere. So they are partnering to have broader reach. right? If you have more outlets involved, you have more audience, you have also the ability to put your information, your content into different incarnations. So like it can take different forms. We heard from a lot of CSOs who said, you know, we love partnering with journalists because it turns our sort of dry 50-page white paper into, you know, a narrative form with visuals that people can, you know, become more engaged with. And vice versa, right? Like, so the journalists who partner with the CSOs, they're happy to have their work be seen by those audiences as well. Number two is the resource constraints that are faced by so many newsrooms today, as we've heard so much about. And also what comes along with that is the specialized skills that, you know, civic tech orgs can bring to a project, right? Or journalists bring to a project, or universities bring to a project, right? So when these topics become so complicated, I mean, these investigative projects are so complicated, they require all these different sets of skills. It is to everyone's benefit if it brings a lot of people together with different skills. And finally, and perhaps most interestingly, there's a greater desire for impact, right? When so many time and resources are put into an investigative project like this, it's really frustrating to not see any impact from it. And of course, most advocates, you know, CSOs, if they're advocacy organizations, that's sort of their reason for being. But for journalists as well, we talked to a lot of people who said, you know, of course, we are neutral and we don't have an end game in mind, but at the same time, like, we want this work to have impact. So that's a really interesting ethical quandary that I'll talk about a little bit more in a second. If you're looking at the full paper or you have the hard copy, we do some history, sort of some historical context and definitional work, which I'm not going to get into right now. So we started by digging in and looking at, like, okay, well, what are these, you know, what's the percentage of journalism in CSOs? So we found that within our sample, so I should also just say, like, of course, this is just within our sample. It could be different if there's a bigger or different sample. Roughly 60% were journalism organizations and roughly 40% were CSOs. Although I want to caveat that slightly by saying that there were like a couple of huge projects like Fincen Files, where it was like 99 journalism organizations and 4 CSOs. So the number actually might be closer to 50-50 than that implies. Next slide, please. Where were the entities based who worked on the projects in our sample? 57% were in Europe and North America. 12% were in Central America, primarily Mexico. Mexico has a lot of cross-field collaboration happening. 11% were in Africa, 10% South America, Asia 2%, 2% others. So again, this is maybe speaks more to our sample than you know, just sort of the snowball method, but it's happening everywhere is one of the main takeaways. We found something really interesting as we were looking through this and thinking through who was involved. We saw that certain countries had entities that were working on projects that were based elsewhere, right? So a lot of entities from the US, for example, are working on projects based in Africa, based in Mexico, based in Europe. And we decided to call those countries sort of cross-field collaboration exporters. We also saw that certain countries had projects that were focusing on them, but they had no sort of homegrown organizations involved. Afghanistan. I'm not remembering all the other ones right now. They're in the paper, but and then finally, we saw a lot of countries where they have projects taking place and their own organizations are working on them. Mexico is a big one again. Some countries in Africa, South Africa especially. So we decided to call those self-directed collaborators. And why does this matter? Well, what we did was we gathered a bunch of census data and gross national income data, and we used Transparency International's perceived corruption index, and we correlated or whether a country was an exporter, subject, or a self-directed collaborator with those different structural variables. And what we found was that, as you might expect, the countries with higher gross national income and lower perceived corruption tended to be the exporters of cross-field collaboration, and the countries with lower gross national income and higher perceived corruption tended to be the subjects of these investigations. And that's why it's important what the topics were. right? Because like, you don't want to be the subject of a cross-field collaboration generally. You know, they're looking into corruption, they're looking into human rights abuses, they're looking into environmental damage, right? So we thought that was really interesting. Next slide, please. And I say that exact thing right there. Next slide. And then again. Thanks. So what is the typical size of a cross-field collaboration? The smaller projects were the most common. So 68% of the projects we looked at have only 2 or 3 organizations or entities involved. By definition, one has to be a journalism organization, one has to be a CSO, right, in order to make it a cross-field collaboration. So that was the most common. Previous slide, please. And similarly for the three organization ones, the 4 organization ones, interestingly, the number between 9 and 30 organizations was the tied for second most prominent size. So they're either really small with like 2 or 3 organizations involved, or they're like somewhere between 9 and 30 organizations involved. And you can kind of imagine those being like the cross-border investigative projects where a lot of journalism outlets are working, and then they bring in a few CSOs, civil society organizations like civic tech orgs and stuff like that, university or whatever. So that we thought was really interesting. 2 slides from here, please. Great. One of the other things we noticed was that of the 1,010 entities in our sample, 778 of them, or 77% of them, had only done 1 cross-field collaboration thus far. And we took that to indicate that there is great potential, right? I mean, and this would require further research, but like, you know, assuming they had a good experience and they just haven't had the opportunity for whatever reason to do another, we think there's like a big, vast, untapped potential for more cross-field collaborations with the organizations who kind of are already familiar with them, have already done one, perhaps had a good experience, and just haven't had another opportunity. Next slide, please. So what does the management funding and differences in perception look like? So let me just say, this is from our survey data. So as with collaborative journalism, where it's journalism to journalism, a project manager is crucial, right? There needs to be someone who is dedicated, at least in part, to managing the day-to-day logistics of the project. Also, unique to cross-field collaboration, what we heard from our interviewees was that this person needs to be very adept at translating the different work cultures, specifically because journalism tends to have a very quick turnaround, as many here know, right? Like there's a deadline, you have to get the information, you have to get it out. Whereas, you know, universities have a very different timeline, very much longer. And then, you know, civic tech orgs have like this tend to be very anti-hierarchical from people we talk to, and they'll spend hours like discussing something and the journalists can get frustrated. So it really helps if there's a project manager to sort of mediate all of those differences. Yeah, great. Yep. Next slide, please. We did not focus a ton of our data on funding because we really just wanted to get like sort of an idea of the breadth and scope of cross-field collaboration to begin, but we did ask about it in our survey. And we found that the most common source of funding, perhaps not surprisingly, is philanthropic funding, followed by self-funding. So a lot of the organizations who undertook these collaborations funded it themselves because they really felt like it was important. They saw the importance of it, and they saw that it was something that would benefit, be mutually beneficial. Government funding was next, and then corporate funding. Next slide, please. One of the other things, by virtue of one of the very nice things about having sort of a large geographic, sample, is that you can do some comparative work. So we noticed that sort of between the global north and the global south, so sort of the countries, North America, Europe, and then like Africa, Latin America, South America, we noticed some differences in the way that people talked about cross-field collaboration. And we just thought this was really interesting. And this is actually borne out in other academic literature on comparing journalism cultures. And I'm not going to talk too much about it here because it's kind of a separate topic in itself, but I'll just mention that we did notice when we talked to our interviewees about this, the journalists who were from the global north, who had been sort of schooled in the tradition of objectivity and sort of Western like neutral journalism, expressed a lot more hesitancy about collaborating with CSOs, especially if they're advocacy organizations. Whereas the journalists from the Global South who we spoke with really didn't have that hesitation at all. In fact, a lot of times they outright rejected any sort of notion that they shouldn't be working with these advocacy organizations. So we found that really interesting. And again, I encourage you to look more closely at the paper because it kind of is an in-depth topic all of its own. Next slide, please. One of the big things we wanted to look at was impact, right? Because as I said at the beginning, this is something that really a lot of organizations who undertake this type of project are interested in. And it's kind of almost one of the very reasons that they do these types of collaborations. So we tried to look at impact and, a couple of things interesting about impact. So number one, it really depends on whether the organizations involved have the resources to track impact and to report it back out. So I think that I was going to try to do something sort of quantitative with impact at first. And then I realized like, it's almost meaningless because the sample is so much based on whether the organization has the resources to track it. So next slide, please. Why is impact difficult to track? 3 reasons. And again, not so different from collaborative journalism. Number one, impact is diffuse, right? Especially when you have multiple, organizations in different countries, different audiences, different, realms of possible effect. It can be very diffuse, and that makes it difficult to track. Number two, the impact data are still often qualitative. You have to track mentions, you have to hear from someone who contacts you specifically, you collect anecdotes about, different government impacts and stuff like that. So that makes it difficult to capture programmatically. And number three, the organizations involved often have different impact measures and different metrics for tracking impact, and they often have different levels of priority in terms of tracking impact. Next slide, please. The other thing is a lot of the impact that results can take months or years to track or to be seen and to be felt. So it's really requires someone who is specifically thinking about and funded to do and dedicated to tracking the impact, months or years later. And that's one of the recommendations we make at the end is that when projects like this is starting, both the funder and the people involved should be very explicit about funding some element, putting funding toward tracking impact, and then also designating like the amount of time after the project ends that impact is gonna be tracked, because that's really, so much of it is just kind of staying on it. Will Fitzgibbon does a really good job of this. He has been tracking impact from the Fincen Files, which is great. And a lot of ICIJ's work. Okay, so I know I'm getting a little bit close to time and I want to leave a little bit of space for questions, but I want to quickly talk about different realms of impact. So this is not so different from other impact, but we did feel the need to sort of go from micro to macro. So individuals, impact on individuals, impact on organizations, impact on political conditions, impact on social or cultural, economic and physical conditions, meaning like the environment. And then we felt that we wanted to break out politics from that. We wanted to break out political individuals and political institutions, because I think that's like such an important distinction in this particular case. Next slide, please. One of the innovations that I was kind of excited about that we made as we were looking, there are positive and negative impacts. That was kind of what we started observing, right? So we would see like, okay, yes, this government official is being, kicked out because of corruption, but also the journalist who was involved, like his car was bombed or something like that, right? So those are both impacts. And I started calling them positive, negative. And I was like, well, positive for one person is negative for another, and blah, blah, blah. So we decided to call them accordant and discordant impacts. Accordant impacts being those that were intended to result from the project. So like the politician being reprimanded, and then discordant impacts, which are not, which run counter to the project's goals. So this would be like all of the adverse impacts on the journalists involved, or something like that. So I think that distinction is really important. And obviously an organization who is funded and who wants more funding is going to be probably less likely to catalog and publicize the discordant impact from their project. But it's really important, right? Like it's important for people who want to undertake similar projects in the future to understand that like this other discordant impact could also result. and how to maybe mitigate that from the beginning. So please check out the paper for all the different examples of, because I can't write a paper without making a matrix. We have, can you do the next slide, please? We have realm and then accordant and discordant, and we have a bunch of different examples of each. But we did find, again, sort of in like a less systematic way, but we did observe that impact on organizations external to the collaboration, but not political institutions. So like businesses, something like that. And on political conditions, accordant impacts were the most commonly recorded and publicized, if not the most common in real life. Difficult to know. Certainly a good field for further research. And as I'm quickly running out of time, I'm going to very briefly mention this very important ethical quandary that journalists who do these cross-field collaborations find themselves in, which is sort of neutrality versus advocacy, right? As I sort of have mentioned throughout, journalists, especially from the Western tradition who have been schooled in objectivity, do have difficulty reconciling those two things. So they want to partner with advocacy organizations to have their work have impact. And but at the same time, they want to be neutral and they don't want to have like a stated end goal for their journalism. Miriam Wells from Bureau of Investigative Journalism is very thoughtful about this, and I would refer you to her work as well. I would like to sort of skip ahead through the slides very quickly because I want to leave time for questions. I have 5 minutes left, 4 minutes now. Stefanie, are any questions coming through? Okay, so then I can, sorry, so back. If we don't have any questions, I can finish with these, but we do, okay.
So Rich Weiss asked, journalism ethics were cited as the obstacle to sharing a recent cross-field collaboration with a larger collaborative. So I think that he's referring to something that he's ran into. Is it ethical for a reporter to share their work product with a partnering nonprofit, or more specifically, checking clarity and accuracy of a nonprofit's study prior to publishing? Haven't journalists been schooled that sharing and reporting in this way is unethical?
Okay. Yeah, this gets exactly to what I was just speaking to. So that's great. Great question. I would say that this is exactly what the journalists struggle with. And the journalists we spoke to who, again, have these sort of ethical quandaries, but choose nevertheless to participate in cross-field collaboration, which I should say also, there was no difference in our sample between participation by journalists from the global north who are more hesitant and journalists from the global south. The journalists from the global north just feel more compelled to like voice hesitancy, but they still undertake these projects at the same rate. And what they've done, we noticed two things that they've done. They have, and there's a slide for this, I think, but we don't have to find it. They have made very explicit guidelines for these projects that they publish. They're very transparent about their work methods and how they are or are not going to work specifically with the CSOs that they partner with. So that's one way. And the second way is by sort of the way they talk about them, the way they talk about these projects. So they are willing to say, listen, like it would be untruthful for us to say that we don't support human rights. It would be untruthful for us to say that we don't think corruption is bad. Like there's a place in which neutrality is like kind of ridiculous, is what they were saying. So I think in terms of the specific question, like whether you should be checking it and stuff for accuracy before, I think that happens routinely. I didn't get the sense from our interviewees that they thought that was unethical, if that helps. Any other questions? I have run out of time so quickly. I cannot believe how fast that 30 minutes went.
You're okay. I think we have like another minute or so.
Yeah, okay, great.
Just to wrap up, I mean, what are some things that journalists should think about before they partner with a CSO or look for a CSO to partner with?
Yeah. So definitely do your research, do your research on the reputation of the CSO, because you're going to want to be transparent about who your partners were in the project. So do your research. Do they have a good reputation? Do they have good sources? Do they have good relationships with the communities that they are working in? Because that is one of the main reasons that journalists, go to CSOs is the CSOs have been working in these communities for a long time. They have great, deep relationships with people. So do your research and just be aware that like there are going to be differences in work culture. There are going to be differences in like timelines and stuff like that. So have all of that hammered out before you enter a partnership. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to tease. We have 2 one-pagers coming out after the summit. One is for journalists who want to partner with CSOs, and one is for CSOs who want to partner with journalists, sort of distilling some of our findings.
Yes, hopefully we'll get those out in the next couple of weeks, hopefully. And we will also be doing a webinar too,
Yes.
Sarah, remember,
Yes.
in June, diving a little bit deeper into this topic for folks who want to talk more. Great. Thank you so much.